And today's special guest is Layman Pascal. He will be talking on Metamodern spirituality and Archaic Futurism. Now, what better title can a person have than that? Layman Pascal was a Canadian meditation teacher, yoga instructor, and philosopher of integral methodology. That was a previous life. Now he is professor, spiritualist, explorer of ideas who follows his curiosity into ever new areas of research and adventure. He describes his life work in a vocabulary that will challenge your understanding and spark your imagination. Enjoy the images called up by his many roles. And don't worry about trying to figure out what every word means as you go through this. We're going to learn from him today. But just let your imagination flow. Layman leads the Metamodern Spirituality Labs, hosts the Integral Stage and Soul Makers podcasts, and provides online courses for the Parallax Academy. He is a founding member of the Archdisciplinary Research Center, the Endemic Wisdom Council, the Spectra think tank for meta-shamanics, Sky Meadow Institute. You remember last week we had a guest who introduced us to the Sky Meadow Institute, and the Respond Project. He is senior editor of Emerge Online and co-chair of the Foundation for Integral Spirituality and Religion. He describes his writing as, and I quote, found in various obscure journals and esoteric anthologies, such as Perspectiva's Dispatches from a Time Between Worlds and Logic for the Global Brain. He is author of Gurdjieff's For a Time Between Worlds, and I hope he'll speak to that today. This curious and fascinating idea of a time between worlds, and is currently working on a collection of essays called Archaic Futurism, as well as a book on Nietzsche. Layman's philosophical work focuses on the metaphysics of adjacency, analytic non-duality, coaxial developmental stage theories, neurological correlates of meditation, sacred naturalism, many-one theology, embodied spirituality, and emerging formulations of the human religious instinct suited to a postmodern civilization facing crises. Layman describes all of his work as the serious playground. So Layman, we are glad to join you today on your serious playground and can't wait for what we're going to learn.
Thank you, Mary. It's lovely to be here. Welcome to a session that in my mind I've been calling Archaic Futurism at Hats. I'm Layman Pascal, and I wanted to note that I just recorded the other day a great discussion with Kaziati Shakti for the Integral Stage podcast about the intersections of Deleuze, Whitehead, and Sri Nagarjuna. She's fantastic, and I'm very excited about her exploration of Marx and Whitehead.
Excellent.
It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy my interactions with people of the process persuasion. I'm what you might call a Nietzschean, Gurdjieffian, Wilberian, Deleuzian, metamodernist, metatheorist, surrealist, and teacher of post-metaphysical spirituality at the intersection of differently flavored developmental, transformational, and regenerative communities. So as fodder for getting a discussion going today, I considered a lot of different things: the work on meta-shamanics and analytic non-duality, the integration surplus model of spirituality and religion, adjacency, community building. But what I settled on was something that might be novel for you and might be useful for me, as I'm working on a book right now for Sky Meadow Press that will come between my volume on Gurdjieff that I released earlier this year and the book on Nietzsche that I'm preparing to write next year. And this intermediate volume is about the imaginal and heuristic dimension of prehistory and what that might be able to teach us about a post-historical epoch. Or as my intimate partner calls it, thinking from the before times about the after times. So there's a lot of stuff in this document that I'm working on: shamanism, bioregionalism, future viable forms of animism, the way that tribes show us potentially how to build new forms of culture, what the psychedelic renaissance means. And I thought I would spend maybe the first 20 or 30 minutes of this session reading out a couple of segments from that volume, the author's introduction, the first section, the last section, and the postscript. And for me, that would be useful because it helps me clarify what I'm working on. And for you, it'll give a sense of the tonalities and rhythms I'm using to think and introduce you to some of my ideas and maybe provoke some thinking that could be the basis for discussions after that. And what I've thought about in order to make this more novel and playful and unique is that I will change hats after each segment that I read. So this is Archaic Futurism and Hats. This is a Tilly that I bought at a hat store in Victoria, British Columbia several years ago. It's excellent in the rain, and the ear flaps fold down when it's cold. So the author's comment from Archaic Futurism goes like this. This is a book about becoming the ancestors of the future human. Our own ancestors thousands of years ago were what we call Stone Age illiterates, but nonetheless they managed to invent art, language, cities, temples, mathematics, mythology, and the C division of what we are now, a technologically innovative species stretching into a distant future. Today we stand, as they did, at a radical juncture in human history. And despite the natural conservative skepticism we should always demonstrate toward wild claims about new technologies and values and the paradigmatic transformation of culture, it's pretty difficult to deny that artificial intelligence, gene hacking, space travel, virtual reality, nuclear power, gravity waves, quantum computing, synthetic life, and dozens more equally strange opportunities and crises can and probably will literally change everything we have hitherto called life on Earth. We are a smart, adaptable species with brilliant engineers, profound moral agents, deep mystics, and powerful metaphilosophies that will all play their part in helping us to surf the chaos of the near future. If we prove to be both wise and fortunate, we will find ways to weave together our ancient timeless truths with new insights and sensibilities for the epoch that is just beginning. That would be success. And our distant descendants then would look back upon us as the curious, possibly noble primitives who gave birth to a new kind of civilization. And that's my prayer for this text. Now, its background is that earlier this year at the ICON Future Human Conference in Denver, Colorado, I gave part of a talk entitled Archaic Futurism. I only gave part of the talk because the situation unfolded into a co-created intersubjective happening that was meant to challenge the ordinary conference format. And the book that I'm writing now contains many of the intellectual points I wished to make in that talk, but didn't quite get time for. It draws together my personal reflections, sourced in my deep participation in the field of flourishing conversations in these overlapping networks of regenerative, transformational, developmental, and integrative communities, which are broadly united in the metamodern spirit of coherent pluralism and emergentism. If the book is successful, in my mind, it will provide a rereadable and ponderable complex collection of condensed provocations to assist our understanding of the role that ancient human practices, ancient attitudes, and social modalities might yet play in clarifying and stabilizing a healthy, emerging, planetary, and potentially interplanetary human civilization. The past and the future are entangled in a myriad of ways, and may we all learn something from the ancient signs of the evolutionary leading edge. So that's the introduction. This is a broad-brimmed straw hat that my mother bought for me in Puerto Rico the last time I was down there. It's a little bit the worse for wear. The first section of the book is the first little mega aphorism is called 6,000 years is recent. And it sort of frames the temporal perspective that underlies this text. The haunting stars of the night sky are impossibly old. Earth also is ancient, and even the human sapient apes have been around much longer than we normally feel. The schools and the reputable books of the late 20th century, when I was a boy, taught that the very first civilization was ancient Sumeria, which invented cities and kingdoms and markets to handle the problems of agricultural production and large populations 60 centuries ago. This was the beginning of written history. Before writing, the experts suggested then was merely a long, inchoate savagery of pagans and pre-capitalists. And such a story was already in many ways a significant improvement over the mythic fundamentalists who asserted that 6,000 years ago the magic author king of the great book created language, humans, and the earth in a couple of days. Today, both the traditional and modernist time frames sound woefully short. Humans have done things such as are found in the large megalithic temple cities in Anatolia at least 12,000 years ago, featuring advanced astronomical calendars and shamanic religion, but without pottery, agriculture, or writing, or any of the things we normally associate with the history of civilization. Before that time, there were complex quasi-nomadic cultures with fluctuating technological and social sophistication who were active from anywhere between 30 and 200,000 years. That means that most of the stuff that humans did, alongside our Neanderthal, Denisovan, and Hobbit-like cousins, took place a very long time before kings and cities and holy books, before writing of any kind. And in the future, we might look back on the human psychology since the rise of the Sumerians as a small passing fad in the great chronology. People today call themselves traditionalists if they adhere to religious and cultural ideas from the last couple of thousand years. But Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and Taoists are newfangled progressives in a story that reaches back vastly far into our unrecorded histories. We tend to defer to written records for practical reasons, but it's also true that our brains find it difficult to embrace deep history with any visceral credence. The eons fade into abstraction unless we make deliberate efforts to connect with the archaeological and mythic traces of our ancestors. In lieu of such efforts, we typically slip either into narratives that retroactively privilege the modernist framing, or else we succumb to romantic fantasies that irresponsibly fill in the gaps of a largely unknown past. Yet our ancestors cannot be reduced either to ignorant primitives or to magical alien human hybrids armed with anti-gravity crystals. At best, they were a curious blend of both highly simple and profoundly advanced. They lacked the dense, fast-moving social consciousness that gives rise to our contemporary cosmic data and universal machines. Yet they may have frequently outshone us in terms of their long-adapted heuristics for survival, thriving, and harnessing multifarious human capacities to co-cultivate rich lives of shared meaningfulness and psychological potency. It's even possible that the great majority of human geniuses lived and died during this long prehistoric period. After all, these people invented language, cities, tools, cartography, art, engineering. Such acts of creative brilliance and world-changing insight are hard to overestimate, and the seemingly simple and pragmatic domains of their engagement do not undermine the sheer intensity of their understanding. We should try to imagine an Albert Einstein devoted purely to stone mounds, a Da Vinci of regenerative horticulture, a Leibniz of raft building. Many Buddhas of many kinds can live and die during 100,000 years. So if we today wish, without slipping into naive anti-modernist reactivity, to become the wise and potent ancestors of a future history of civilization, we may need to challenge ourselves to look back and gather the half-hidden wisdom of deep time in service to our current cultural inflection points. And this is a very warm Canadian toque that I got when I worked briefly for the post office. This is section 64 on art. We were given a great gift by the archaeologists of the 20th century. They began an enormous planetary effort to discover, date, restore, and explore Paleolithic painting. Our scientific and cultural authorities were forced to acknowledge that the human impulse for art making was profoundly robust and almost impossibly ancient. It is hard for us to even conceive of human beings, separated by intervals measured in thousands of years, crawling deep into haunted mountains through claustrophobic tunnels to inscribe Picasso-like images on cavern walls by flickering torchlight. What that tells us at the very least is that our shared drive for art is not merely commercial, fashionable, or trivial, but rather it is archaic, universal, and infused with a force of fateful necessity. But why should it be so important to depict, evoke, distort, and play with representational and ornamental patterns? Although we can easily understand the practical utility of straightforward language to organize affairs and express opinions, it is now commonly asserted that song, image, decoration, and sculpture are as old or much older than any technical use of words, names, and sentences. It is these preverbal or transverbal domains that our interpersonal neuroorganisms seem to project through, discover with, and get hold of by the very flesh of their culture. In the practices surrounding the production and contemplation of arts, we behold a human function that both digests the world, attempts to change the world, and elicits the emerging spiritual potentials of life as biocultural beings. Art humanizes the world so that we can actually inhabit it. And in imaginatively becoming indigenous to our geology, ecology, and tools, we encounter portals and pathways that carry this momentum further into mutations of sensitivity and sensibility that we collectively recognize as uncanny but deeply desirable. As our material, energetic, and informational tools evolve, we are continuously in need of art's unique ability to humanize and sacralize our external conditions. Techne requires poiesis in order to become a world space. Only a deeply sensitive and imaginal appropriation of exterior sciences, technologies, and living conditions can generate necessary meaning and enchantment in our postmodern lives. Beyond any questions about self-expression, representation, and commodification, the artist has a sacred shamanic role to help us become indigenous to the techno-global village in this world historical moment of epochal transition, just as they served that same role in the long age of world building that preceded recorded history. We began with art the last time. Perhaps we must begin with art again. This is a sturdy cowboy hat that I bought at a shop on Salt Spring Island in British Columbia 2 years ago. It reminds me of 1970s Burt Reynolds films. Now, at the end of this text, after I've done these 64 sections, I've written something I call the postscript on the myth of the cultivators. It has a number of subsections. Part 1 is the legend. The story of Atlantis is a world legend. Western scholars encountered it through Plato's writings, But the seductive concept of sophisticated lost civilizations is a powerful attractor within the shared imagination of many human cultures. Telling such tales serves multiple functions. They allow our Promethean spirit to explore speculative futuristic possibilities by retroactively describing the putatively advanced technologies and social practices of a forgotten golden age. They are also provocative fodder for our mystics, artists, and romantics who require some shared mythic discourse in order to undertake their idiosyncratic probes into the fantastical recesses of the mind. And of course, they are also placeholders and alluring hints about actual complex ancient cultures, many of whom were profoundly obscured by the dramatic post glacial rise of sea levels and are not yet fully established within the consensus narrative of today's archaeology. Max Planck famously said that the science of physics progresses one funeral at a time, and perhaps some similar law of intellectual and evidentiary entrenchment governs our prehistorical and archaeological mainstream narratives. It is also quite likely that the latent capacities of our own phantasmatic subconscious intelligence, submerged since early childhood, finds a convenient projection screen in the stories of lost submerged civilizations. Beyond these obvious forms of social utility, we might additionally imagine that tales of wondrous capacity and curious motives among our suprahuman ancestors are like special vitamins necessary to prepare and promote a healthy cultural diet. It turns out we may need such legends in order to permit ourselves to play our most dynamic potential roles in the ongoing human adventure. And at any rate, it is in that spirit that I present here the bare bones of a legendary speculation that links the archaic eon with the emergent radical future. I don't know the name of this one. I borrowed it from my girlfriend. Part 2, Lineage. During the oscillating phases of glacial melt at the end of the last ice age, robust human communities, forged in ice and fire, came forth into the spring of the world. Vast new territories and unexpectedly lush resources seduced them beyond their traditional inherited boundaries into larger nomadic circuits. These semi migratory populations began to encounter each other with increasing frequency. Such encounters fell into the specialized skill set of mature, open minded outliers and alienists within the clans. These inside outsiders often negotiated deals, arranged for ritual cultural exchanges, and oversaw the liminal hinterland between diverse territorial claims. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and dwarf humanoids, and the multifarious Homo sapiens populations exhibited a wide range of sophistication and primitivism, cooperation and aggression, trauma and curiosity, mediated through divergent genetic, linguistic, and ritual morphologies that must often have felt to the average clansperson as heretical or at least deeply uncanny. So it required Gnostic intermediaries and shamanic diplomats to create functional alliances. And in the long centuries of this diplomatic process, perhaps they often discovered that these had much more in common, cognitively and temperamentally, with each other than they did with their own tribes. A new ethos became possible as these uncommon characters got to know each other more deeply. Esoteric networks, magical fraternities, and ritual sororities arose and began to perpetuate themselves as a symbolic lineage of meta-tribal psychotechnologists. As these networks grew slowly, they entered into an extended period of mutual inspection and experimentation, in which their combined wisdom of entheogens, trances, ordeals, rituals, breathing exercises, concentration styles, insight provocations, and strategies for developmental education were cross fertilized. The resulting lineages of the wise both seeded their own clans with useful practices and incrementally developed a shared visionary project or great work concerning the benign transformational cultivation and interlinking of all the human tribes. This is a simple cap I got in March to go on a uh, stay with some friends in Mexico. I bought a whole outfit, absolutely unlike anything I normally would wear. I looked like a college kid on a cruise ship. It was awful, but the hat fits quite nicely. Part 3, the new tribes. Tribes that were benevolently infested by this lineage experienced general improvements in many areas of practical life, as well as in their own emotional well being and mental capacity. The multidimensional cultivation of cultural fields, individual psychologies, local ecosystems, and human tools began a slow and steady increase, punctuated by periodic breakthroughs. These tribes shared with each other new discoveries or practices in geological, horticultural, architectural, zoological, hydrological, and navigational domains. And despite their differences, they were allied in an overall ethos of cultivation, improvement, and flourishing. These tribes were also de facto laboratories for the lineage's increasingly sophisticated and daring experiments in the use of what modern people call hypnosis, and this led to a Cambrian explosion of cultural mobilizations and psychological intensifications. These combinations of trance work with psychedelic practice, proto yoga, robust peer support, transdisciplinary pedagogy, intensive study of mathematics, architecture, practical chemistry, and astronavigation, fierce ordeals, and relentless concentration practice became a kind of supplemental education oriented toward producing high competence, high confidence, and high complexity. There was in these senses the conditions for a statistically unusual production of what we might today call cooperative geniuses who could envision, plan, and collaboratively enact large scale projects that still puzzle us today. This is a different kind of Tilly hat. It's got more of a cap look. It's extremely warm, very comfortable. I don't find a lot of use for it anymore because I'm mostly in Ontario and I double down on toques, but this is the hat I wish I wore more often. Part 4, the developmentally deliberate diaspora. These new tribes were more prosperous, innovative, and expansive in their thinking, and periodically participated in explorations organized by the large minded and large souled members of the lineage. These Mesolithic and megalithic shamanic cultivationists obeyed a very straightforward organic logic in which they grew richer foods, richer minds, better buildings, richer rituals, and better tools. And in this generalized flowering, they felt a natural impulse to seed and spread their fruitfulness in an organic manner. They had a proactive agenda to locate, enhance, and interlink various pockets of human beings who they felt were ready for such an upgrade. Promising populations were revealed by shrewd ecological guesswork, visions, and fragmentary oral information passed among the allied tribes. Under the guidance of mystics, mathematicians, and stellar cartographers, missions were sent as far as their technology, luck, and determination would take them in seeking for cousin communities to bring into the fold. Their materials were simple by modern standards, lacking metallic, plastic, electronic, and industrial features, but their sheer ability to make innovative and extraordinary use of wood, stone, soil, botanicals, animals, and human labor was far more astonishing than anything exhibited by the primitive agricultural kingdoms who came much later. And these missions were led by robust, highly competent, polymathic, and spiritually developed members of the lineage who could meet new pocket populations with warmth, intelligence, charisma, linguistic adaptability, and a wealth of immediately useful pharmacological, architectural, and horticultural practices. A relatively standard protocol for contact might begin with befriending, impressing, and helping the locals, while studying their culture and building alliances with any individuals high in trait openness, or who had esoteric experience and trans-tribal forms of cognitive complexity. Buoyed by their proven usefulness and friendliness, the missionaries could then begin making suggestions. Typically, these involved locating special geographic and geological sites that combined imaginal, energetic, and pragmatic advantages. Each site was consecrated to a local deity, spirit, or ancestor, and then reinforced with walls, mounds, trenches, ritual platforms, and calendrical alignments. These special locations would be presided over by esoteric transdisciplinarians who would hold meetings, provide community rituals, undertake special inner practices, and encode their accumulated understanding in images, geometries, dances, monuments, and other locally appropriate schemes for the transmission of intergenerational knowledge. These sites could then be connected by roads, expanded into cities, aligned by star mapping to other distant population centers, and evolved into larger pyramids, temples, and sacred mountains. Future indigenous populations, which replaced or descended from these cultural centers, typically exhibit three traits. Firstly, they try with limited success to replicate the intellectual and practical projects of the old ones. Secondly, they exhibit many residual technologies that still seem oddly sophisticated and whose origin they can give only in vague or supernatural terms. And thirdly, they consistently tell stories about a time when strange, attractive, and complex visitors taught the lore of the stars, numbers, buildings, poisons, medicines, boats, and trances. This is I always put a wig on, but I'm not going to do that. This is a kind of old-fashioned scout hat. Part five, last part, I think, the fall. Technologies take on a life of their own. Trauma typically begins to promulgate itself, and the haphazardry of time erodes many precious things. If you combine these factors with periodic phase shifts of the ecology, then you have the conditions that slowly begin to undermine the great network of allied tribes under the influence of this lineage. Secrets were lost, factions arose, the temple settlements gave way to city-states organized by scriptural bureaucrats and political authorities. The practices of writing, pottery making, and urban living generated a new balance among human brain functions, which in turn evoked a new self-reinforcing cultural sensibility. Competition between rival city-states often exploded into violence and left legacies of wounding that became intergenerationally enshrined within the hearts and minds of citizens. Initially, the remaining esoteric cultivationists were able to exist at the outskirts of the new city-state civilizations, or sometimes in secret urban enclaves, where philosophical sanctuaries, new brotherhoods, and special religious roles were evolved to protect them from the molestation of monarchs, oligarchs, and institutionalized hierarchies of belief cults that were allied to the state. Protection was also needed because this new form of human living seemed to result periodically in waves of public hysteria and regression, in which the now only half trained wise people were sometimes hunted down and accused of uncanny seditionary practices. Over the last few dozen centuries, a few strong-willed, multifaceted, and daring transdisciplinarians would occasionally combine their own personal experiments with a synthesized apprehension of hints picked up from surviving esoteric artifacts and the legends of various traditions. At such moments, often accompanied by brief Renaissance periods in the general culture, there would emerge clandestine or elitist approximations of the old lineage, resurrecting aspects of its practices, along with distorted versions of its vision for the great work. And such esoteric orders frequently collapsed, grew decadent, or shed their identities like snakeskins from generation to generation. Among those technological, political, and philosophical innovators who gave birth to the modern global society were a great many who had been trained, half trained, or allied to these Reconstructionist movements that were often called lodges, fraternities, secret societies, or special clubs, and which were a very mixed bag of economic conspirators, experimental occultists, and progressive intellectuals. And now it is now. This one, it's not technically a hat, but I always loved wrapping scarves into headdresses when I was a kid, so I'm going to try that now. 6. The serious playground of yesterday's tomorrow. The speculative history I've just laid out is not an academic hypothesis, but a story designed to leverage our imaginal appreciation of the archaic as an aid to envisioning and deeply feeling into future possibilities for a wise, organic, and multidimensionally constructive future humanity that can survive and thrive beyond the meta crisis of modernity's accumulating and convergent deficits. Our ongoing potential for individual psychological growth and collective action is far greater than what we see in the everyday business as usual activity of our emerging planetary civilization. Neither is it well reflected in the periodic, often regressive mass movements that stylize late modernity. The dominant ideological machinery of bipartisan nationalist and globalist culture is not providing an edifying story in which depth oriented human self cultivation, meaningful eco cultural flourishing, and proactive intergroup alliances can be successfully undertaken during this emerging period in which both the civilization and the biosphere are in profound flux. As we stand at what may be the far end of Game A civilization and look back at the human ideation and cultural practices out of whose sheer creativity civilization was born in the first place, we must absorb both the actual and the imaginal lessons of prehistory. The concept of a deep lineage of cultivationists, whatever its historical truth, is one of a handful of myths that we could be telling each other about the feasibility of great and worthy human transformations. May we be as creative and potent as the best of our ancestors as we face the beginning of a new chapter in the history of our planet. Everything still remains to be invented. All right, that's enough of me reading for the moment. Where do we go from there?
Wow. Wow. You are yourself creative and potent, Layman. Thank you so very much. Your presentation is like, reminds me of fireworks, the gathering of energy, and then the explosion of energy into surprising and beautiful forms. So thank you for this. It was, we were for a time living between worlds. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now our Director of Communications is going to join us. Jared Morningstar, many of you know, is a splendid thinker himself. He is a metamodernist, a process thinker, and much more. He's the Director of Communications for the Center for Process Studies. And today he's been instrumental in bringing Brendan last week and bringing Layman this week, and he's going to get us started in our conversation. Jared.
Thanks, Mary Elizabeth. Layman, good to see you. Thank you for your offering here. I think I need to ask maybe the question on the top of everyone's minds to start out with. What was up with the hats? How did this fit together? Was it just fun performance, or was there kind of a artistic direction behind this aspect of the presentation?
There's no special sequence to it. The theory, in a sense, is to make these kinds of spaces more fun and more lively and engage the intellect and another part of ourselves simultaneously. But also, when you initially reached out to me and I was thinking about what I could present, you sent a message saying, well, some people do different kinds of performances. And so I immediately was trying to think of an intellectual performance and some kind of more playful improvisation. So I just, Archaic Futurism and Hats, which I actually think could be the title of the book. Like maybe I just include a lot of pictures of hats as I go along.
It would certainly be an interesting approach, interesting element. I do remember when we were in Denver for the Icon conference, we encountered that strange individual on the street who you complimented his hat, and he said, "You haven't seen anything yet." So I wondered if that story maybe was part of the inspiration there. Uh,
Yes,
anyway,
I'm fulfilling his prophecy.
yes, there you go. Perfect. One thing I kind of wonder here, our community talks a lot about this idea of ecological civilization, transitioning from our industrial, post-industrial mode to something that, yeah, is in some ways very inspired by much more harmonious past cultural expressions and relations with nature. But at the same time, it's not just ecological. There is this civilization aspect too. Yeah, I'm wondering how you see this kind of archaic futurism connecting to that idea. I certainly heard hints of kind of ecological focus in your presentation, but could you draw that connection out a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, and I think a lot about um, the value of conceiving the human enterprise as a function of the biosphere. I think that's a kind of story we can tell ourselves where we situate our own internal developmental practices and cultural efforts as functions of that system in a way that can be really useful for us. Another thing I think a lot about that is several sections of this book is what I call sacred naturalness, which subdivides into the sacralization of the natural and the naturalization of the sacred. But at the heart of that kind of deeper relating and deeper twinning and mirroring is this sense I have that the thing we point to as natural, which is distinct from nature itself. Nature includes everything, but we mean something specific when we say natural. We mean a kind of generative, diverse, flourishing condition that's good for us and good for ecosystems. That's a holy thing, and that we should be working on that in general, and that our ability to do that depends upon a richer mutual mapping between ecological and human, social, anthropological, technological domains. So, all of the ways in which we can make the human space patterned a little bit more like the ecological space, I think helps us create a general civilizational shift that embeds ecological patterning. So, some ways we can do that are biomimicry, right? We're trying to take the forms that emerge in nature and use them for scientific enterprises. One way we can do that is through psychedelics and through foraging, where you take more aspects of nature into your body and into your nervous system. Other aspects include just having an educational system that's much richer in how it foregrounds understanding of the geology and the ecology of the world, and less so the socio-political dimension of the world, which often gets overemphasized. So there's a variety of ways you could start listing these out. There'd be hundreds of different kinds of approaches to making the human patterning and the ecological patterning, which are fundamentally non-separate, but more reflective of each other. Now, anciently, that happened more or less automatically because they were completely immersed in the natural environment, right? We sometimes go into a beautiful cathedral and we go, oh, fantastic. And then we go out into the woods and go, wow, this really reminds me of the cathedral experience. But for the longest normal period of human history, the forests were the cathedral. That all of our education, all of our pedagogy, including our spiritual and existential developmental education, took place in conditions that we would now call the wilderness. And so it so completely immersed our experience, we had no choice but to be socially aligned with that. Now we have a choice. So now it has to become a more intentional practice. We've also learned a lot of new elements at the level of science and structure and philosophy about what comprises ecological types of patterns. So I think what they can show us anciently is what it looks like to have a closer match between the anthropological and the ecological, and some of the spirit that it takes to participate in reality that way. But we have to be able to do that in a more thoughtful, more intentional, and more wide ranging manner than they did.
You just know something good is brewing when ancient is used as an adverb. So thank you for that. Mary Elizabeth kind of hinted at this this idea of this time between worlds. So I mean, certainly, yeah, if we're transitioning from whatever kind of civilization we have right now to ecological civilization, or moving into this period of archaic futurism, what's going on with this transition? What are some of the characteristics of it? But then, yeah, if you could kind of sum up, what is the role of these shamanoids, these people who are in touch with certain aspects of this archaic lineage? How do they, what's their role in this transition? And what are they leading us to?
Hmm. Yeah, the phrase "a time between worlds" comes from Zach Stein, and it refers to several discrete moments in the history of civilization, such as the birth of the modern period, and the sense that we're in one of those now, in which our general approach to living, our general approach to education, the general way we map and make values and tell common stories is changing. Now, there are two ways to talk about the time between worlds. One is to think about it as a kind of interval that's characterized by strange, chaotic, uncertain patterns in human beings, such as, excuse me, such as we see now, and such as I'm sure all the Americans on the call are experiencing on their election day to some degree. Another way to look at it might be that the strangeness we're seeing is actually characteristic of the new world that we're going into, and that the thing we call the time between worlds is actually itself the new world coming forward, a world that will be characterized by peculiarity and intercontextuality and a kind of liminal strangeness or in-between type quality that we may have to get better at. So those are the two ways to think about it, and in both of those senses, the character of the shaman and the broader thinking we've been doing around shamanoids, which would be people who are neurotypically the sorts of people who would have been selected for shaman training in ancient civilizations. But since we don't necessarily have that training today, they're scattered through the other elements of the world, sometimes successfully and sometimes disastrously. But these people, I think, have two advantages, an advantage for each of those two scenarios of the time between worlds. On the one hand, they're very fertile, they're very experimental. They have a lot of the capacities needed to artistically and experientially and philosophically dream the forms of the new world into existence and to convene with both ecological and collective human intelligence patterns that operate outside of the consciousness of the individual. These people are like weather vanes that can call down the lightning if they have the training and support that they need. So that's important for generating a new kind of cultural moment, just as it was important for generating any of the tribes or cultures that began at the early points of human civilization. If we look at it from that other side, where the feeling of being in the interval is actually not because we're between two things, but is the flavor of the new thing itself, the flavor of the new civilization coming forward, then these people have an additional function, which is to be um, demonstrators and educators of what it's like to live in edge conditions, right? That they specialize in being at the edge of the village, in doing rituals at dusk and dawn, in walking between two worlds, between bridging different kinds of realities, that they are neurogenetically driven to this kind of activity themselves. But as we enter a period of time that might be characterized by those flavors, we have to look to people who have more experience of that, and those people would be the ones who are driven to do it, regardless of their time and place.
Yeah, there's so much here that I'm glad you're sharing with our community. Okay, here's an interesting question. So you're not trying to simply get us to have this golden age nostalgia for prehistoric civilizations. You're not trying to propose a scientific hypothesis about these earlier peoples. But there is a lot of kind of beauty and richness you're pointing us towards in this kind of imaginally reconstructed archaic period. What has actually been gained in sort of these intervening phases, say the traditionalist, but then also the modern phase? Certainly, there's something there that we might also want to take forward and yeah, how does that fit into the futurism aspect of this archaic futurism?
Yeah, in some sense, you could say that it's the futurism itself that has been gained, right? That, well, we could imagine people at the dawn of civilization having premonitory senses of a distant human project. What we've achieved by specializing in left brain technical skills, building up our technological base, and mapping the cosmos at a much richer and more fine grained level than was previously available is a sense of um, the structural complexity of a world that can't be understood directly through individual perception, right? That we have to be much more skeptical or open to adding in information that's not obvious to beings. And that information is, I think, by and large, information about the future. That when we look back and when we focus on inheritance, as many people still do, and that's very important, we often undermine the sense of the beauty and importance and radical strangeness of what's coming toward us from tomorrow, the kind of half emergent telos of the world that can be. And it seems to me that that futuristic sensibility is available to us because of the way technology has stabilized civilization, because of the new of art and entertainment and exchanges of information scientifically, and because of the richer mapping of the cosmos that's been available to us through our machines and our metrics. When you get a very rich sense of the cosmological layout, you almost by necessity start to move toward your own leading edge. You start to feel like a futurist in some sense, someone who's gone halfway to meeting a future that isn't quite here yet. So it seems to me that the whole futurist aspect of this emerges very naturally from the scientific project. Now, there are a lot of people like, I'm a strong fan of and friend to Ian McGilchrist's work, and he's one of many people who look at the last few thousand years and point to its technological and left brain dominance, right? Which I would say starts with pottery in a very interesting way, which we could get into. But the pattern is not merely a pattern of deviation from a more balanced or even a more right brain dominant form of thinking that we had in archaic periods. It's a beautiful arc of its own that leads back to a new form of that balance. That if you start to follow the seemingly reductive, analytic, scientific mode that takes things apart into its components in order to understand them and reduces them to the smallest possible level, it first looks like you're desacralizing the world. And if you run that program for a few centuries, you get a very despirited, desacralized, mechanistic kind of worldview. But if you keep running it, you start to find the fractals. You start to find the plasma currents in deep space. That very same technological and reductive mapping starts to discover that at the roots of its own enterprise are all of these other complex, rich, multidimensional, nonlinear patterns. So I don't think we can just say that was an error of some kind. It seems like a special subtask within the general approach that has led back to the balance point in a new and enriched way.
So, you've just written a book about Gurdjieff. One of Nietzsche is on the way. Say a bit about how figures like these, which are a little more accessible to us than the shamanoids of pre-recorded history, can contribute to this project, and say a word also about what you find unique, valuable in our process community here. As I know you're tuned in, you've said some nice stuff about the process people. So yeah, where are our contemporary sources here?
Well, first of all, I always notice that the process communities they're like a bit of a garden. They're very supportive and protective to today's shamans and witches, especially when they have a philosophical, artistic articulation capacity. So I admire them for that. I think there are figures in recent philosophic history who have done an admirable job of pulling together the philosophical thinking of the last several thousand years, and at the same time pointing to the ways in which it needs to overcome itself. Right? Nietzsche is a rather remarkable and artistic figure in that sense. Whitehead is a very remarkable and artistic figure in that sense, as are a number of other scholars. And what they seem to do is to bring the aesthetics and the affects and the vitality and the cosmicism back to the Western philosophical tradition, which you could say is a way of reinfusing it with the shamanic spirit in order to prepare it to help the culture go forward to a place that needs to be both re-anchored and transformed. Nietzsche is endlessly fascinating to me because the complexity of his phrasing allows you to go back to him again and again and always discover something new and something that feels risky and provocative. And I think we've had through the 20th century, it's been very difficult to get a sense of what he was actually talking about. And I gamble on the side of thinking that he was attempting to be a kind of a shaman, a kind of a mystic, a kind of an integrator of philosophical and aesthetic dimensions of life in a way that was looking to the near future emergence of people who could solve the meaning crisis. He saw what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis way ahead. He saw the modern and the postmodern or modern critical of itself moves coming, and he thought they were all contaminated by the same kind of error that Europe had inherited from its last several thousand years, which was a way of thinking about its highest ideals such that they ended up sabotaging themselves, resulting in a collective feeling of nihilism or dispiritedness. And he was looking towards new sets of ideas, new ways of working with nature, new kinds of communities that could start to address and handle that problem. And I think the kinds of communities we call metamodern or integral or process oriented, these are the types of communities to which he was calling out, for whom he was writing, because he frequently says he's addressing people who don't exist yet. Right. And 100 or 200 years later, maybe we are starting to exist. The people who could hear his message in the way he hoped it would be heard and not in the way it provokes many people to take it. Gurdjieff is a radical, practical, spiritual, and philosophical character. He takes a lot of that and he turns it into dances. He turns it into meditations. He turns it into strategies for inner effort and inner struggle. He's a very strange figure, a very funny figure, a very creative figure within the tradition of spiritual avatars or great teachers in the world. The work is not fully inspected yet. I think very few people have really heard of or explored Gurdjieff, and the people that have are sort of divided into uh, rogues who take over part of it in their own fashion, and the attempt to preserve a kind of classical legacy version of Gurdjieff, which is admirable, but maybe not as rich and lively as we need it to be. So it seems to me there's a kind of renaissance coming in his work in which it will be more publicly acknowledged and in which the diversity of people who've been appreciating it can be reintegrated together to show us some things about the principles of practical existential development and self-transformation that will be needed for the kind of world we're going into. So I think most of Nietzsche's ideas, for example, and many of Whitehead's ideas can be found in some version in Gurdjieff's teaching. But what he brings is the individual force of character and the practical orientation towards individual praxis that's needed in order to start instantiating that as the spirituality of a new epoch.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm sure we'll need to have a whole session on Gurdjieff sometimes because yeah, I think you're entirely right. Super rich material, underappreciated, but the Renaissance is certainly here. I know the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions is having a big Gurdjieff conference in about a month, something like that. And it's filled up. They are full. So always an interesting sign. But all right, last question I have here for you before we turn it over to the group. So our ethos here with the program and the Cobb Institute more broadly is looking at not only process thinking but process modes of living you've certainly talked a lot about all kinds of different kind of ways of being in the world here, but say a bit about the Metamodern Spirituality Labs and how in this community, in this space, we're trying to play around, cultivate yeah, new forms of spirituality, new modes of community. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so Brendan, who some of you met last week, uh, has been writing and organizing a lot of the diverse metamodern philosophies together into one place, although still there's a lot of richness and discussion about what metamodernism means. And one of the reasons to favor metamodernism is in some sense that it's a nebulous and wide open concept. It's not as branded as, say, integral or process philosophy might be in their own ways. But he came into control of this wonderful piece of property in Vermont and reached out to me to see if I would be the intellectual and spiritual practice kind of coordinator and leader of some events where we could gather people to bring the metamodern cultural ethos and the necessity for deep inner practice and real spiritual work together in some way. And how do we look at that? What is the mood we need to establish? What are the balances we need to get right? How do we collectively explore and inquire into the different phases that we inherit from the spirituality of human history? These are the kinds of questions we're looking at. So we have these twice a year events in Vermont. The idea was to make them more regular because you probably all know that in these spaces there's a lot of uh, written content and a lot of video content and a lot of social networking that goes on. And we all get the sense that we really have to get together in person somewhere to take it to the next step. But those kind of events are often few and far between and a little bit erratic. So our sense was we have to make them predictable so that people can put them on a calendar. So we have a spring event and we have a fall event. Each one gathers and has a introductory week where people explore different practices, and cultivate a ritual that will frame the weekend. And when the weekend comes, a larger number of people show up, and we collectively inquire into one thematic element of classic religion. So we did the goddess last time, we did God, we did breath work for one of them, we did goodness for another one. In the spring and May, we're going to be exploring the subtle realms, so to speak, subtle energies and subtle entities, and like how do we approach that as a metamodern community of both theory and practice? And in the practice element, you have to really change yourself and have experiences and have perceptions and encounter the things that are under discussion. And in the theory part, we have to figure out how to honor all the different kinds of paradigms that exist in an evolving perspective. So, what's a really primitive take on this? What's a very modern take? What sort of critiques would postmodern consciousness bring into this? We can't just believe the things we're talking about and the things we're seeing. But because we bring a critical and ironic distance, that doesn't mean we want to sabotage the sincerity and the human transformational and heart potential that's available through all of these things. So that's a very open, very lively kind of thing. And I think what we've really found, though, is that the way that the groups that come together in this place interact with each other culturally and emotionally, and the way they interact with place is largely the engine of what we're doing. So we're trying to, we've now got a sense of what the flavor is that we're working on, and we allow it to sort of teach us. We're evolving rituals, we're evolving next time's inquiry through these practices. So there's a kind of recursive element by which a certain kind of cultural style is being built up, and it's starting to spread a little bit. We get a very interesting mix of people, but there's been a suggestion that we'll have one in California as well next fall. So I think the really great thing about it, other than the practices and the people and the flavor, is that it's open and it's lab oriented. Initially we called them retreats. Now we're calling them labs because we're explorers, we're experimenting. We want the people in these communities to ask questions, to try to figure out how this new cultural sensibility inspects these classical spiritual possibilities. But also, we want them to bring in every kind of practice and every kind of idea they have, and also to challenge themselves to be providers of these things. So, the part that excites me the most, not only because it means I don't have to do all the work, is when somebody in the community can be elicited forward to teach this, act on that, try out this thing, when they have a kind of practice that has been on the tip of their mental tongue for a while and they haven't had a chance to test it out with a bunch of reliable peers. That's in some ways the most exciting part, because there's always going to be an element of this that we don't understand, and that the evolving field itself has to show us by tasking us to stay at its emerging edge. So I find them extremely exciting and rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo your sentiment completely, and I certainly invite anyone in our process community to come in the mix. I mean, these are, yeah, we're trying to make a cauldron of weird flavors of esoteric and spiritually sensitive,
Also,
intellectually sophisticated
if you
people.
have no clue what metamodernism is,
That's fine.
you're just like everyone else who's there. Yeah.
Yes. Uh, Wonderful. Well, Layman, I mean, I could talk to you all day. We certainly have before, but I'm very excited to turn this over to our group and get to be a fly on the wall while you talk with, yeah, some people who are very close to my heart in our community here. So thank you.
Terrific.
Conversation between the two of you has been wonderful. And you've generated a lot.